What if I told you that on one summer day, the fate of Rome was decided in a matter of hours on a dusty field in Thessaly? Imagine an empire that was accustomed to fighting barbarians at the edge of the world, and now turned its weapons inward against its best commanders. It was not just two armies that clashed on that field, but two different versions of the future. Two images of Rome, which could become either a strict aristocratic republic or the personal arena of one man. The Battle of Pharsalus was the moment when centuries-old republican institutions proved weaker than personal charisma and military talent. This story is not only about maneuvers and regiments, but also about the fears of senators, the ambition of military leaders, and the fatigue of ordinary soldiers from endless uncertainty. Watch the video to the end, and you will learn how one battle turned the Roman Republic into a ladder that one man climbed to the top, while everyone else was left behind as mere steps. Are you ready to learn the truth about why the confrontation between Caesar and Pompey was inevitable long before they met at Pharsalus? Long before the Civil War, Rome was accustomed to living in a state of paradox, where power officially belonged to the people and the Senate, but in reality, control of the Republic passed to those who commanded soldiers and brought home trophies. Pompey the Great became a hero before Caesar even had a chance to prove himself, and his name was associated with victories in the East and the ability to bring order where others had failed. He was a favorite of the Senate, although he aroused fears because he too often returned from wars with armies personally loyal to him. His path was that of a man who was accustomed to negotiating with the aristocracy and receiving high offices as a reward for his service. Caesar reached the top by a different route, through debt pits, dangerous alliances, and constant risks that could have ended in trial or exile. He excelled not only in the military sphere, but also in politics, knowing how to speak to the crowd in a way that none of his rivals could, and turning personal defeats into long-term investments in his own image. For many senators, he was a warning sign, a reminder that the people could love a man more than old laws and traditions. His campaigns in Gaul gave him an army of veterans who knew his voice better than that of any city order. These people were ready to follow him anywhere because they had seen him up close for many years, in the mud of the camps, not somewhere far away in marble halls. Formally, Caesar and Pompey were once allies, bound by a treaty that went down in history as the first alliance of influential people who divided the Republic between themselves. This alliance was not an alliance of friends, but a temporary agreement between people who understood that together it was easier for them to control the Senate and the popular assemblies. But behind the outward agreement lay a simple truth. There could not be two people in Rome, each of whom was accustomed to deciding the fate of provinces with a wave of their hand. As soon as their common interests disappeared, the old agreements turned into a chain that each sought to break first. Within this hidden struggle, a future war was gradually taking shape, in which it was already clear that there would be only one winner. The Senate tried to balance between them, but over time began to lean towards Pompey, considering him more predictable and convenient for the aristocracy. Many senators saw Caesar as a threat to their usual privileges and dreamed of bringing him back to Rome as a simple citizen who could be tried for abuse of power in the provinces. For Caesar, this meant not just the loss of his career, but the end of his entire biography, built on continuous upward movement. Pompey found himself in the role of guarantor of the Senate's interests, although until recently he had been as dangerous a figure to them as his rival. This reversal of roles created a strange symmetry in which the former favorite of the people became the mainstay of the conservatives, and the former debtor and adventurer became their greatest fear. Pharsalus did not come out of nowhere. It was the result of decades during which the army became increasingly attached to the personality of its commander rather than to the abstract concept of the Republic. Soldiers began to talk not about serving Rome, but about serving Caesar or Pompey, and this small difference in wording eventually outweighed entire volumes of laws. Too many mutual grievances, unfulfilled promises, and insults spoken in Senate debates had accumulated on the political scene. When words ceased to work, the legions came to the fore, and it was up to them to decide whose version of the future would prevail. It would be very interesting to hear your point of view. Whose story seems closer to you, the cautious Pompey or the risky Caesar? And what is more important to you, stability or change? Write about it in the comments and be sure to subscribe to the channel. What you are about to learn is often hidden behind a short phrase about crossing a small river. When Caesar and his legions approached the Rubicon, the Romans still hoped that the conflict could be resolved at the negotiating table rather than in the fields and camps. But behind this step lay a long chain of ultimatums and orders that left him with less and less room for maneuver. The Senate demanded that he return to Rome without his army, effectively exposed to his opponents. For a man who knew the price of trials and political reprisals, this was tantamount to voluntarily giving up his defense. The crossing of the Rubicon was the point where a personal decision became the fate of the entire republic. Caesar chose a path where each subsequent step made retreat increasingly impossible. His legions marched on Italy, and the cities along the way more often opened their gates to him than tried to resist. Pompey and his supporters decided not to turn Italy into a field of protracted battles and retreated, shifting the center of resistance to the east. Thus began a war in which both sides tried to present themselves as defenders of law and tradition, and their opponents as destroyers of order. Pompey had an important advantage. He controlled the fleet and could unite the eastern provinces, rich in resources and people. His plan was to use these resources to organize a large army far from Italy, where Caesar felt particularly confident. Senators who feared the proximity of Caesar's legions left the city with relief and went to Pompey, turning his headquarters into a mobile political center. For many, this was not just an escape, but an attempt to save the image of the Republic, at least on foreign soil. Rome temporarily ceased to be the place where the fate of Rome was decided. Caesar acted differently. He sought not only to win battles, but also to show moderation whenever possible. Having taken cities, he avoided showy reprisals and tried to persuade rather than just coerce. This did not mean softness on matters of principle, but it created an image of a man who did not destroy for the sake of destruction. He quickly suppressed resistance where it was weak and moved on, not allowing his opponents to gain a foothold. His strategy was constantly driven by a desire to prevent Pompey from using time as an ally. Not only speed, but also the direction of troop movements was decisive. Caesar understood that if he allowed Pompey to calmly gather his experienced troops from the east and Demosthenes' veterans, the clash would be much more difficult. He tried to force his enemy into a premature battle, preventing him from completing his preparations. Pompey, on the other hand, played for time, counting on Caesar's troops becoming tired and exhausted far from their supply base. Do you think Pompey's cautious strategy was wise or a mistake that cost him the victory? And would you like to find out what the armies looked like just before the clash in the next chapter? The secret that is rarely mentioned is that it was not just large armies that clashed at Pharsalus, but two different types of military experience. Pompey's army was significantly larger in number, and this gave the impression of an unstoppable force. He had many allied contingents, cavalry from different regions, and fresh legions that had been assembled relatively recently. There was a feeling in Pompey's camps that victory was almost guaranteed because they had the support of most of the senators and the familiar slogan of defending the Republic. But behind this outward confidence lay something more fragile than it appeared. Caesar's legionaries were fewer in number, but they were men who had gone through the Gallic War, long marches and difficult campaigns. They were used to their commander taking risks with them and demanding no less from himself than from others. There were fewer newcomers in their ranks and more veterans who had seen time and again how the enemy's numerical superiority dissolved under the pressure of organized action. For these men, Pharsalus was not the first test and not the first battle in which they were told they had little chance. This habit of moving forward even when the numbers were against them became an important part of the overall mood. The atmosphere in Pompey's camp was more complicated than it might seem if one looked only at the reports on troop numbers. Many soldiers had been recruited recently and did not have the personal connection to their commander that made Caesar's legions almost a family community. Among the officers, there were endless discussions about how exactly to fight, and not all decisions were made quickly. The senators who were nearby brought with them not only authority, but also a habit of arguing, pressuring, persuading, and interfering. Pompey's army embodied all the complexity of Roman politics. Caesar understood that a direct comparison of forces was not in his favor, and he relied on discipline and precision in his formations. He carefully selected the location for the camp, monitored supplies, and tried to maintain a sense of confidence among his men, despite being outnumbered. He had fewer cavalrymen at his disposal, but he compensated for this with the flexibility of his infantry and their ability to maneuver even in confined spaces. Each legion had its place in the overall scheme, honed over years of joint operations. It was an army accustomed to carrying out orders quickly and without lengthy discussion. Two models of military power converged at Pharsalus. One relied on numbers, external legitimacy, and the support of the majority of the political elite. The other relied on cohesion, personal authority, and the training of people who had repeatedly tested each other in campaigns. At such moments, the battlefield became a kind of test bench on which history compared not only swords and shields, but also the very principles of the organization of power. If you are interested in which army you found more convincing in spirit, share your thoughts in the comments and like this post to support new analyses of great battles. I will reveal to you a secret that is often left out of descriptions of this battle. The field at Pharsalus was not the ideal arena depicted in diagrams. It was a living space with its own unevenness, dust, and terrain features. The choice of location was an important part of the preparation, as it determined how effectively each side could use its strengths. Pompey counted on the width of the front and the space where his numerous cavalry could deploy and outflank Caesar's infantry. He saw his numerical superiority as the key to future victory. Caesar, on the other hand, sought to prevent his opponent from fully exploiting this advantage. He positioned his troops so that the space for cavalry maneuvering was limited, and his infantry could rely on the depth of the formation. For him, it was more important to create a stable, controllable order than to impress anyone with the scale of the deployment. He understood that in such a battle, one mistake at the beginning could lead to an avalanche of problems in the middle of the battle. Therefore, his preparations were precise and pragmatic. The camps were close enough to each other that the soldiers could see the lights of the opposing side and hear the sounds of nightlife in the neighboring camp. This created a special tension when the anticipation became almost heavier than the battle itself. On such nights, the difference between those who believed in their commander and those who were still trying to understand how far this conflict would go was particularly acute. The camps were not only a place of rest, but also a space where rumors were pondered, orders were discussed, and personal plans were made in case of victory or defeat. Pompey received a lot of advice, mostly insisting on a wait-and-see tactic. His army was larger, and many believed that Caesar would exhaust himself if he was not given a quick battle. But the longer the two armies stood opposite each other, the stronger the pressure grew from those who were waiting for a decisive move. The nobles and horsemen who had come from different parts of the Republic wanted not an indefinite camp, but a clear result. This mixture of impatience and confidence in numerical superiority gradually tipped the scales in favor of a more active approach. The field of Thessaly became not only a geographical point, but also a symbol. Here it was decided whether the Republic would be able to withstand the internal tension that had built up over decades, or whether it would erupt in one powerful burst. Every hill, every line of formation, every road along which supplies were delivered fit into the picture that would later be called the end of the Republican era. Do you think a different choice of tactics and location could have changed the outcome of this story? And would you like to find out exactly how the armies lined up on the decisive day in the next chapter? There were no grand speeches for the record that day, but there were many brief glances, handshakes, and quiet orders. The morning at Pharsalus began with the usual camp activities, but everyone understood that the familiarity was deceptive. The soldiers prepared their equipment, checked their straps, tightened their belts, performing familiar movements that were somewhat reassuring. The officers moved from row to row, checking the alignment of the lines and the mood of the men. There was a mixture of dust and anticipation in the air, which made every action seem a little more significant than usual. Caesar, as before, showed himself to the people, not separating himself from their preparations. He knew that for his army, it was not only orders that were important, but also his presence, the feeling that their commander shared the risk with them. His words were short and clear. without complex imagery, but they conveyed the confidence of a man who had repeatedly emerged victorious from difficult situations. He did not promise an easy victory, but reminded them of previous battles that had seemed hopeless on paper and ended in triumph. For many of these people, this was enough to gather their inner strength. In Pompey's camp, the morning was different. The abundance of influential people around the commander-in-chief created a special atmosphere where everyone wanted to be heard. Pompey had to not only command the army, but also constantly take into account the opinions of those who saw themselves as guardians of the Republic. He wavered between the idea of waiting and the pressure of those who demanded to finally use their numerical advantage. In the end, the decision was made to go out onto the field and give battle, which many considered an almost guaranteed victory. But internal doubts did not disappear. The advance of the troops to their positions turned abstract plans into reality. The columns that had recently been standing in camp were now deploying in line, ready for battle. Each step on the dusty ground shortened the distance not only between the armies, but also between the Republic and a future that no one fully understood at that moment. But it was already clear that after this day, much would not return to the way it was before. There were fewer and fewer glances backward. The silence before the first signal seemed almost unnatural. Footsteps, the clanking of equipment, and short commands could be heard. But the most important sound, the one that made the field a battlefield, was still missing. In those moments, every man, whether a simple legionnaire or an experienced tribune, was alone with his thoughts. Some recalled previous campaigns, others their political hopes, and still others simply sought to fulfill their duty as accurately as possible. This morning was the line beyond which personal plans were subordinated to the general course of history. What if everything you were taught about the importance of numerical superiority is outdated, and it is not the number of shields that matters, but the skill with which they are used? When the lines met, the first stage of the battle unfolded in a relatively predictable manner, with both sides lining up according to their plans. Pompey counted on his numerous cavalry to strike Caesar's flank, hoping to throw back his horsemen and get behind the enemy's infantry. His left flank seemed particularly impressive, and many observers believed that this was where the outcome would be decided. The cavalry was not just a decoration for the army, but the key with which they intended to break through the enemy's formation. Caesar anticipated this move and prepared a response. Knowing that his own cavalry was outnumbered, he placed additional infantry units behind it, formed in a special formation. These men were to become an unexpected barrier for Pompey's cavalry if it broke through. They were ready to act faster and more flexibly than is usually expected of infantry, and their task was not so much to attack as to stop and disrupt the onslaught. This decision showed how carefully Caesar had analyzed the enemy's strengths. When Pompey's cavalry advanced, the planned scenario began to change. The enemy did indeed push back Caesar's horsemen, but they encountered a previously unseen barrier of infantry. The sudden encounter with prepared ranks, which acted confidently and in unison, disrupted the usual course of such an attack. Instead of expanding their success, the cavalry encountered resistance for which they were unprepared. Confusion crept into their ranks, and with it came dangerous gaps. Meanwhile, the main infantry converged in the center. Caesar's veterans advanced with a polished sequence of movements honed over years. They knew how to withstand pressure and wait for the moment when the enemy's fatigue became more noticeable than their own. Their commander was in no hurry, allowing the general movement to develop as he watched the enemy gradually exhaust their strength. On the surface, it looked like a stubborn but ordinary clash of lines. But inside, a slow reversal of initiative was taking place. The advantage began to manifest itself not simultaneously, but in specific areas. Where Pompey's cavalry expected success, it found itself tied up and crushed, losing its ability to control the course of the battle. The infantry, seeing the wavering on their flank, gradually lost confidence. The army, built on an impressive scale, began to shrink under the pressure of a more compact but stable enemy. At some point, it became clear that the initiative had finally passed to Caesar and his men. Are you ready to ask yourself whether the situation could have been turned around at that moment? And do you want to find out how the defeat affected the fates of the participants and the Republic itself in the next chapter? When it became clear that the line of defense was collapsing, many eyes turned to Pompey. Until recently, his name had been synonymous with stability and strength. But at Pharsalus, his authority was put to a test for which he was unprepared. The collapse of the front was perceived not only as a military defeat, but also as a blow to the image of the man who was supposed to be the defender of the Republic. His staff found themselves in a situation where they had to choose between attempting to restore control and ensuring their own safety. Those seconds of decision-making were long remembered. The retreat of part of the troops quickly turned into a withdrawal that was difficult to control. The army, which had recently been confident of victory, was now looking for a way out of the field, where every small path seemed like a chance to avoid complete encirclement. Officers tried to gather people into new lines, but fatigue and disappointment got in the way. Many understood that failure in such a major battle would have consequences that would not be limited to the loss of a few medals. Defeat here meant the end of an entire political project. Seeing the destruction of his structures, Pompey decided to leave the field and seek salvation in new alliances. For some of his supporters, this was a sign of final defeat, while for others it was the last hope for continuing the struggle elsewhere. But the very fact that the commander-in-chief had left the battlefield was painful to accept. Unlike Caesar, who was accustomed to sharing not only triumph, but also risk with his people, Pompey found himself in the role of a leader who had abandoned his army at the most difficult moment. This undermined his former image. The victory at Pharsalus gave Caesar not only military superiority, but also symbolic capital that could not be ignored. He became the man who was able to defeat the one who was considered the bastion of the Republican tradition. In the eyes of his supporters, this meant that history itself had recognized his righteousness. In the eyes of his opponents, it meant that their world had collapsed. After Pharsalus, his actions were no longer simply those of a successful commander. They were the actions of a man on whose decisions the future of an entire empire depended. Caesar understood that military success alone was not enough to consolidate the new order. He needed to show that he was ready not only to win, but also to rule. His policies reflected a desire for moderation, at least outwardly. He often demonstrated a willingness to forgive those who had recently been against him, seeking to turn former enemies into allies. This created an atmosphere in which people who had suffered defeat could hope for a place in the new order. However, behind this moderation lay a harsh reality. Caesar had effectively become a man whose word meant more than any formal procedures. The Senate continued to meet, magistrates were elected, but it was clear to everyone that their scope for independent decision-making had been greatly reduced. The Republic continued to exist outwardly, but its mechanisms were gradually being adjusted to the will of one man. Pharsalus became the justification for this process. The Battle of Pharsalus was not only a military episode, but also the point from which the end of the Republican system began to be counted. Before that, conflicts between influential people could end in compromises, exile, or temporary defeats. Now, one such conflict ended with the victor gaining the opportunity to rewrite the rules of the game. The Senate no longer appeared to be a force that could stop or even limit his will. Roman political culture also changed. Whereas previously coalitions of families, complex voting procedures, and lengthy speeches in the Curia played a decisive role, after Pharsalus, the presence of troops increasingly became the main argument. Politicians understood that without the support of the army, their words carried less weight than the orders of a popular commander. This gradually pushed the other players to the conclusion that they either had to submit or look for opportunities for a new coup. Thus, in the shadow of Pharsalus, future crises were born. For ordinary citizens, the changes were felt through practical measures. Reforms, handouts, holidays, and new construction projects created the impression that a strong hand could give more than the strife between aristocrats. Many welcomed the order that replaced the chaos of the late Republican years. But behind this order was a concentration of power that was already difficult to dilute. People were getting used to living in a world where one man could make decisions faster than the entire Senate. Today, when we remember Pharsalus, we see it as more than just a clash between two armies under the summer sun. It was the moment when Rome itself chose who its future belonged to, even if that choice was made through a chain of decisions by generals and senators. Caesar's victory paved the way for further events, which included new reforms, new crises, and new figures on the political scene. But the starting point for many of these phenomena lies precisely there, in the dust of the Thessalian field. In this sense, Pharsalus was not the end, but the beginning of an entire era. The legacy of this battle was also evident in how the figure of the commander himself came to be perceived. Whereas previously a successful military leader had to return to the framework of republican office, now a model of a man who essentially stood above them had emerged. This changed the very meaning of a career in Rome. Young, ambitious people saw Caesar as an example and understood that the highest goal might not be the consulship, but the opportunity to hold all the strings in their hands at once. Pharsalus became both a lesson and a warning for them. For subsequent generations, the Battle of Pharsalus became a symbol of how a single civil war could reshape the political landscape for centuries to come. It was Caesar's victory that paved the way for the emergence of the system we now call the Principate. Moving away from formal descriptions, we can say that on that day, Rome took a step away from a complex mosaic of balances toward a simpler but more rigid vertical structure. And this step could no longer be reversed. The Battle of Pharsalus remains one of those moments when history seems to be compressed into a few hours and concentrates decades of contradictions. It was not only Caesar and Pompey who clashed in it, but also two different models of the future, each with its own strengths and weaknesses. Rome made a choice, perhaps without fully realizing its long-term consequences, and could no longer return to where it had been before. The Thessalian field became a symbol of the end of the Republic and the beginning of the path to autocratic rule. Do you think Caesar's victory was a tragedy for Roman freedom or a necessary step towards a more stable order? Share your opinion in the comments and be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories about battles that change the course of history.